This morning, at exactly 4:37 a.m. Eastern Time, an emergency policy draft circulating inside Washington triggered what could become the most explosive fracture in North American power relations in over a century, at least in this fictional geopolitical scenario. According to internal briefing materials discussed among senior economic and security advisors overnight, U.S. officials suddenly prepared a staggering $935 billion emergency economic countermeasure framework aimed directly at Canadian energy corridors, rare earth mineral exports, and the financial clearing networks supporting nearly $1.2 trillion in annual bilateral trade between the two nations. If such a move ever unfolded in reality, it could destabilize the most peaceful border on Earth within days and send shockwaves through global supply chains tied to North American resources. Yet the deeper implications of a crisis like this would likely take mainstream outlets hours, sometimes days, to fully grasp. So subscribe right now, because what this scenario reveals about the fragile balance of power in North America may completely change how you see global stability. In the next few minutes, we're going to break down this fictional crisis step by step, because what appears on the surface to be a sudden economic confrontation may actually reveal something far deeper. First, we will uncover 3 hidden triggers that could explain why a $935 billion pressure strategy would even be drafted in the first place. Then, we'll examine the economic chain reaction that could ripple across North America's $1.2 trillion trade network. And finally, stay with me to the end. We'll explore 3 possible endgame scenarios, one of which could permanently reshape the balance of power across the continent. To understand how a crisis of this magnitude could even begin to form in this fictional geopolitical scenario, we have to step back and examine the underlying pressure points that quietly shape the relationship between the United States and Canada. On the surface, the two countries share the longest peaceful border in the world, a deeply integrated economic partnership, and decades of strategic military coordination through NORAD. But beneath that stability lies a complex network of energy dependence, resource competition, and financial infrastructure that makes the relationship both powerful and fragile. Let's break this scenario down systematically. Evidence 1. The energy artery of North America. The first pressure point lies in energy. Canada is one of the largest energy suppliers to the United States, exporting millions of barrels of crude oil and massive volumes of natural gas every day through pipelines that function like the arteries of the continent's industrial system. In this scenario, if Washington were to suddenly target those corridors through an emergency economic framework worth $935 billion, the goal would not simply be punishment. It would be leverage. Energy disruptions on this scale could trigger price volatility across North American markets within hours. Manufacturing costs would spike. Transportation networks would feel the shock almost immediately. And investors watching the stability of the continent's resource flows could begin to panic. Legendary investor Warren Buffett has often warned that energy security is one of the most underestimated foundations of economic stability. In interviews about infrastructure investments, he has repeatedly emphasized that energy transport networks function as the bloodstream of modern industry. In a fictional crisis like this, even a partial disruption could ripple through financial markets faster than most policymakers anticipate. And that leads us directly to the second pressure point. Evidence 2. Rare earth minerals and the silent resource war. While oil and gas dominate headlines, the future of global industry is increasingly tied to rare earth minerals, the materials used to manufacture advanced electronics, electric vehicles, military guidance systems, and next-generation batteries. Canada possesses enormous deposits of these resources, particularly in regions tied to strategic mining initiatives that have become critical to Western supply chains. In this scenario, a sudden economic countermeasure targeting Canadian rare earth exports would immediately raise alarms among technology manufacturers and defense planners across the United States. These minerals are not just commodities, they are strategic assets. Supply disruptions could slow production for entire sectors of the technology economy. Semiconductor fabrication plants rely on a steady flow of specialized materials. Battery manufacturing for electric vehicles depends on carefully balanced mineral supply chains. And defense contractors require precision materials for navigation systems and advanced electronics. This is why economists increasingly describe rare earth minerals as the oil of the 21st century. If access to those materials were suddenly threatened, even hypothetically, the shock waves would reach far beyond North America. Global markets would begin recalculating risk, commodity prices could surge, and rival economic powers would immediately begin maneuvering to exploit the disruption. Which brings us to the third and perhaps most overlooked pressure point. Evidence 3. The financial clearing system. Most people think of trade as physical goods crossing borders. But the real backbone of modern commerce is financial infrastructure. The settlement networks, currency flows, and institutional clearing systems that quietly process trillions of dollars every day. In this fictional scenario, the proposed countermeasure framework does not only focus on resources, it also targets the financial systems that enable cross-border payments between Canadian exporters and American buyers. That might sound technical, but its implications could be enormous. Nearly $1.2 trillion in annual trade flows between the two countries. Interrupting even a portion of those financial settlement mechanisms could freeze transactions across energy companies, manufacturing suppliers, and agricultural exporters. Former Federal Reserve officials have repeatedly warned that financial infrastructure disruptions can escalate faster than traditional economic sanctions. When settlement systems slow or stop, companies cannot move capital, contracts stall, markets react instantly. In fact, many analysts argue that financial leverage has become the most powerful geopolitical tool in the modern era. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why would policymakers even consider drafting a strategy this extreme? Evidence 4. Strategic signaling. In geopolitical strategy, sometimes the goal of a dramatic policy draft is not immediate action, but signaling. Governments occasionally develop large-scale contingency plans to communicate strength, deterrence, or negotiating leverage. In this fictional scenario, the existence of a $935 billion economic framework could be interpreted as a message rather than a finalized decision. The signal might be aimed at influencing negotiations, reshaping trade dynamics, or reinforcing strategic priorities tied to energy and technology supply chains. Former U.S. national security officials have often described economic pressure frameworks as tools designed to shape behavior before a crisis escalates further. The mere existence of such plans can influence how allies, competitors, and financial markets respond to unfolding events. Tech entrepreneur Elon Musk has frequently commented on how fragile global supply chains can become when critical materials or infrastructure face disruption. In discussions about industrial resilience, he has noted that modern economies depend on supply networks that are far more interconnected and therefore more vulnerable than most people realize. A fictional scenario like this highlights exactly that vulnerability. If energy flows tighten, rare earth supplies wobble, and financial settlement networks come under pressure simultaneously, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada could suddenly look far less stable than history might suggest. Now pause for a moment. If you're beginning to see how quickly a complex economic partnership could spiral into a full-scale strategic confrontation, even hypothetically, hit the like button, because the deeper implications of this scenario are only starting to unfold. And here's where things become even more complicated. Because once a crisis like this begins to take shape, it rarely stays contained within the two countries at the center of the conflict. Markets react, allies react, supply chains react, and once those reactions begin to compound, the entire geopolitical landscape can shift faster than anyone expects. Which means the real question is no longer whether tension exists in this fictional scenario. The real question is, what happens next? Because if a pressure strategy of this magnitude were ever pushed beyond the drafting stage, the clock would start ticking. Economic alliances would face stress, political leaders would be forced into rapid decisions, and every major player connected to North America's trade network would begin preparing for the consequences. That's where the situation moves from analysis to outcomes. And the outcomes are where the real danger begins. At this stage in our fictional geopolitical scenario, the situation reaches the point where policymakers can no longer delay decisions. Once a pressure strategy of this magnitude enters the strategic conversation, the next steps tend to unfold quickly. Economic alliances begin recalculating their interests, investors start pricing in risk, and political leaders face a narrowing set of options. Let's examine the three most plausible scenarios that could unfold if a crisis like this were to escalate. Scenario 1. Full de-escalation through negotiated compromise. In the first scenario, both sides recognize the enormous economic stakes involved and move rapidly toward negotiation. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels open almost immediately. Economic advisors, trade officials, and security analysts begin working through a series of emergency discussions designed to prevent escalation. In this outcome, the pressure framework remains largely symbolic. The very existence of a massive $935 billion countermeasure proposal becomes a negotiating tool rather than an active policy. Concessions may be exchanged quietly. Adjustments to resource agreements, new supply chain cooperation mechanisms, or revised trade frameworks. Markets would likely respond with cautious relief. Investors prefer stability and even partial reassurance that the North American Economic Partnership remains intact could calm volatility. The crisis would fade into history as a moment of tension that ultimately reinforced diplomatic cooperation. But that outcome depends on both sides choosing restraint. Scenario 2. Partial compliance and strategic realignment. The second scenario is more complex. Here, neither side fully backs down. Instead, the confrontation produces a partial compromise that leaves long-term trust damaged. In this outcome, selected economic measures might be implemented while others remain suspended. Trade policies shift, supply chains begin to diversify. Energy producers explore alternative export routes. Technology manufacturers search for new mineral suppliers. Over time, the economic integration that once defined the relationship between the two countries begins to loosen. Not overnight, but gradually. This is how many geopolitical shifts actually occur in the real world. Not through a single dramatic rupture, but through a slow restructuring of alliances and economic dependencies. And that restructuring could have global implications. Because when major economic partners begin repositioning supply chains, the ripple effects travel across continents. Scenario 3. Complete strategic breakdown. The final scenario is the most destabilizing. In this outcome, negotiations fail. Economic pressure mechanisms move from drafts to active policy. Trade flows slow dramatically as new restrictions take effect. Investors begin withdrawing capital from sectors tied to cross-border industries. The result would not simply be a bilateral dispute. It would be a continental economic shock. Manufacturing networks across North America depend on seamless movement of resources, parts, and financial transactions. If those networks begin fracturing, the consequences would spread quickly through energy markets, technology industries, and transportation systems. In a worst-case outcome, the crisis could reshape the strategic landscape of the entire region, forcing governments and corporations alike to rethink decades of economic integration. And once that process begins, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Which brings us to the final question. Because when tensions reach this point, even in a fictional scenario, the world starts watching what happens next. In the end, what this fictional scenario reveals is how quickly even the most stable partnerships in the world can come under pressure when economics, resources, and geopolitical strategy collide. For more than a century, the border between the United States and Canada has symbolized stability and cooperation. But as global supply chains tighten and strategic resources become more valuable, even long-standing alliances could face moments of extraordinary tension. If a crisis like the one we explored today ever began unfolding, the clock would start ticking immediately. Markets would react, governments would reposition, and the balance of power across North America could begin shifting faster than anyone expects. So here's the real question. Who would ultimately back down first? Do you think economic pragmatism would prevail, or would strategic rivalry push both sides further? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis.